Shalom, shalom. Giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim El Shai, Bashim Makakwadash, double honors to the apostles and others of great millstone for teaching this truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aqua for your lesson. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I want to talk about basically just an exhortation, just to keep, your mental strength up in regards to inferiority complex and how much Esau has an inferiority complex. So not to actually think of yourself, basically thinking well of yourself, right? A lot of us, grow up in particular circumstances, and we think because of those particular circumstances, we start to think very well of ourselves, depending on what might happen. Maybe you didn't grow up with both of your parents, maybe you didn't have a father around, maybe you had some particular addictions, maybe you were ridiculed from one of your parents, maybe it's your mother or whatever, and a lot of us develop these thinking very poorly of ourselves, because of these particular circumstances, as well as coupled, I would say this also coupled with Esau basically, defacing essentially the images. The scriptures talk about in Revelation about how Satan would be loosed out of his prison for a little season. So after that, 1,000 years, where we were ruling, as kings, dukes, duchesses, basically in positions of rulership, Esau began to deceive the world. So essentially, not the spiritual demon Satan, but as it says in Thessalonians, a man will come in that spirit, in that vibration. So Esau went about, defacing the images through what you call today as iconoclasm, breaking up, the images of how the Lord looks, how his son looks, how the true judges, would look, right? And because of these things, coupled with those things, you Israelites you don't think very well of yourself because of those things, because image is very extremely important. Seeing proper imagery. That's why I have this imagery, in the front here, because our people don't really see themselves as the people that are supposed to be in authority. You see yourselves as peasants. You don't see yourselves as nobles, as the Lord created us to be a nation of kings and priests. Let me actually start there, and then I'll get into really more of the bulk of like what I kind of just want to touch on. I don't really have much of a plan, but this is something that's kind of been on my mind, seeing certain clips on YouTube, how basically how the Israelite man, the so-called black man, the Israelite man in general is well more sought after than by the other nations, and has a universal appeal, by in terms of the women of the other nations, as opposed to the women of sorry, I should say it like this, the men like Esau specifically, right? They're these other nations, their men are very guarded about their women, especially Esau, because he realizes and is realizing that a lot of Israelite men are more sought after, have more universal appeal, right? So damn, what was that precept I wanted to get? Oh, that's right, the water. This is Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, and it says, "And ye shall be unto me a nation." Unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, meaning separate. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, right? So we're supposed to be a holy nation, which is basically above all these other nations, right? And what I wanted to touch on real quick, because of Esau specifically, because I was watching this, certain clips, a lot of, and I actually had a testimony as well, not really a testimony per se, but I should say it like this, more of a feedback from an Israelite confusion of face woman, a woman that doesn't look like, she looks like more of the other nations, right? And how a lot of so-called white people, basically look, they tend to stay away from those women that actually have dealt with so-called black men, right? So inferiority complex refers to a psychological term coined by Alfred Adler describing a deep, persistent feeling of inadequacy and insecurity. It stems from an actual or perceived physical, psychological, and social deficiency caused by a person to believe they are fundamentally do not measure up to others. It says how it manifests. It says withdrawals, so they might become highly timid and are socially isolate themselves, avoid trying new things out of the intense fear of failure, overcompensation. This is key here. It says that they may become excessively competitive, aggressive, or perfectionistic to mask their feelings of inadequacy. So not feeling enough, right? So it says here, in some cases, this overcompensation develops into a superiority complex, and this is something that Esau has, and he exudes this or pushes this vibe upon you Israelites, because he really and truly is intimidated, by you and your presence. When especially if there's too many of you, congregating, and you're actually dwelling, in unity. You're dwelling in peaceably among brethren, because Jacob is a plain man dwelling in tents, right? So Jacob's really cool and laid back, but Esau doesn't like when you're actually, because Jake is naturally superior. As a matter of fact, let's go to the story in the beginnings real quick. um, because Jake is you Israelites are really the ones that are you so-called blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and you speckled bird tribes. I'm sorry, speckled bird, Israelites that look like the other nations, that resonate strongly with the what's it called? Understanding, that your descendants, from Jacob, and dwell amongst a lot of, so-called, like, Israelites and so on and so forth. Most likely you are, an Israelite, because pursuant to the curses, we got scattered, right? So we would have Israelites basically looking like the other nations. Anyways, um, this is Genesis 25, verse 23, and it says, "And the Lord Yahweh said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people are separated from thy bowels. And one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." And it says, "And when her days be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there are twins in her womb, and the first came out red all over and like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau." Excuse me. Verse 26, and it says, and after his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. Right. So, this is basically going into the birth of the two nations. So you had Jacob and Esau, right? Esau Edom, as it expounds more in Genesis 36, and then Jacob, eventually his name would be changed to Israel, and Israel basically, what's it called? A nation and a company of nations would be begotten from Jacob's loins, right? Which would be known as the 12 tribes, But, it's I wanted to read that to show that, Jacob was really the one who's naturally, superior, whether it's physically, and they understand this, they know this. When you think about in slavery times, for example, you had sex slave breeding. They weren't taking their own people. If we were truly inferior, think about this for a second. Now, if we were truly the people who were inferior, why are you taking our own people to be able to breed and breed essentially strong slaves? Why would you do that? Why not use your own people if you're really the one who is truly superior, right? So it shows again, that you Israelites are superior, and they understand that. The other nations, the surrounding nations, understand that. Let me give you another good example. Let me go to this quick account here. This is really actually dealing with when we were actually in Egypt. But, Esau, they have this fear at the same time. This is Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, and it says, "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly and mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." Right? So, because Joseph had very good relations with the Pharaoh before, right? And it says here, he said unto his people, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more mightier than we. Come on, let us deal with them. Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out from any war, they join themselves unto our enemies and fight against us. So get them out of the land," right? So basically, the time of Egypt, and then eventually you hear, then that's when we started becoming like afflicted by the Egyptians and serving, I should say, hardcore, rigorous slavery. They were very fearful of the fact that we were multiplying. It's the same concept when you think about it in America as well. But when Jake, began to basically multiply, and and then you see all the abundance of the different tribes, and then that's why they had to get a lot of you so-called Mexicans and Haitians. They had to ridicule a lot of you guys, on the on TV, trying to deport you and so on and so forth, because they're very fearful of the abundance of you Israelites dwelling together. And that's another thing also, because we're really well known for multiplying to a high amount, as opposed to the other nations. The other nations are not doing like that, so think about this for a second. China used to have something called a one child policy. I'm not sure if they still have it, where they would just have one child, and and think about this, all these other surrounding nations are dealing with birth rate crisis, right? But what we know naturally within our culture is the ability to have more than one wife, right? That's naturally something Jake does, right? That's very embedded within our culture, right? But the fact is that we're the ones that multiply like crazy, especially the tribe of Ephraim, that's known for being very, very fruitful, right? So, but the point is, these other nations are very nervous, at your presence, right? So you shouldn't think of yourselves the way Esau thinks about himself, because the scriptures talk about how, as is the king, so are the people, right? Because he operates in a mindset, that is naturally inferior, because he constantly has to sabotage your excellency to make you feel like less of a person, right? He's done that throughout the ages. For example, like I just mentioned before with the images. Now let's take a step back and think about this for a second. Let's just say Jacob. This is what Esau does. Let's just say, for example, hypothetically, Jacob and Esau are running a race, right? A track and field race, right? What Esau has to do, they're both starting at the same pace. You know, they both start at the same line, right? What Esau has to do is he has to sabotage Jacob's success. So how would he do that? He would do it by, maybe he will do some schemish plots, like maybe he would tie Jacob's, shoelaces together so he trips and falls. Maybe he'll put some thumbtacks along the way, so Jacob would injure his foot. Maybe he might put something within Jacob's drink, something that's not that can slow him down. Maybe he might, like, think about, that's what Esau has to do. And if somebody is truly superior, you won't have to do that. But why does Esau have to do that? Because he's really the one that's truly inferior. It's not true Israelites. You got to get that mindset, you know, out of your head, right? This is Deuteronomy 7:6, and it says, "For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy power. The Lord Yahweh thy power hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all the upon the I'm sorry, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." Right? So this is what Esau has to do, right? Because he understands you Israelites' greatness. Let me get this in Habakkuk as I was describing that. Because think about this. As I said before, Esau has to constantly sabotage your excellence, your excellency. You know, there's a saying, within, certain, like Israelite households, sometimes you got to work 3 times as hard and stuff like that. You know, but the thing is that, Esau is the type of person, he has to sabotage you. So how does that sabotage play out? It plays out in many different facets. So for example, our family households, we're known for not having a father in the household. That's one thing that we're strongly known for. You know, and pedestalizing the mother. So basically destroying the family unit. That is one way, Esau would try and sabotage your so-called race, as I was describing before, the way you're able to run. He will do it through other ways as well. Like I said before, defacing the images. That's another way. Poisoning your essentially your neighborhoods. Rap music. Promoting a very low vibration of music, where you're able to commit crime, and then you commit crimes, and then Esau is basically justified in putting you behind bars, through, so you had, certain musicians like NWA, back in the 80s and the 90s and so on and so forth. And this is when, what's this guy's name? That president, Richard Nixon. Well, back in the 70s, really and truly, he pushed and declared the war on drugs, but really in covert terms, it really was a war on you Israelites. It was a war on Jake, because they couldn't, they had to use very covert terms, and this is why it's important to be illuminated, because the scriptures say, "Turn thou, O Jacob, that thou mayest be illuminated," because he really, he was using cunning, crafty words, but basically to get at you Israelites. You know what I'm saying? To basically to get you to support policies that would criminalize your own children, and then vilify you on the news. So you start to be seen as always the bad guy. You're not seen as somebody, as a judge. You're not seen as a noble. You're not seen as a duke, as someone who's actually an authority. You know what I'm saying? This is what Esau has to do. And there's multiple different facets of Esau, basically poisoning your environment, so basically to slow you down, because he knows he's naturally not superior, right? So it says, this is Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 15, and it says, "Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, and puttest thy bottle to him, and maketh him drunken also, and thou mayest look upon their nakedness. So Esau, then you think about it, and that's so funny too, because that's the so-called Native Americans. You guys, you're more well known for that, for having and dealing with a lot of alcoholism within your how do you call those things, your reservations, right? He dealt with you, and he puts, you know I think there was another situation where he put what was it, I think it was smallpox within the blankets, within the children's blankets, right? So Esau is really a devil. He's not somebody to be trusted, right? He puts and creates conditions where it's basically trying to sabotage your success, right? To sabotage you as an individual, right? So not to think of yourself like the way he thinks about himself. That's why knowing your history is really empowering and super important. And knowing the things of what your forefathers did, what your Hawashai did, is really and truly empowering, right? So I wanted to read, I just wanted to get a quick example, something that's empowering, right? So you can break up those strongholds of how you think about yourself. But I wanted to read this in Sirach actually as well, to get away from that mind state. Because ultimately, when we're in like when we come into understanding of knowing who we are, a lot of us have like, what's it called, like addictions, and you struggle with certain things, right? Where is it? I think that's Sirach 39. Oh, I'm sorry, it's 38. This is Sirach chapter 38, verse 9, and it says, "My son, in thy sickness be not negligent, but pray unto the Lord Yahweh Bashem El Shai, and he will make thee whole." Right? So, sickness, yes, it can refer to an actual sickness, right? But at the same time, it can also refer to like a mental sickness too, because the scriptures talk about in Isaiah, the first chapter, how the whole head is sick, right? And now people lean on these different comforts to actually try and be healed, right? You have a comforter, you have a physician. Yahushua said it himself. He said, "They that are whole don't need a physician," because he was sitting, with the, I guess you can call it, I don't want to say poor, but basically like the people who were, they knew that they knew that they had infirmities, and then, they needed help, so to speak, right? Right. He said, "They that are poor don't need a physician, they that are sick," right? "I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance," to roughly paraphrase. And that's how you become more healed, right? So healing yourself, right? And becoming more whole within Yahweh Shai, right? And that will, that would invigorate you, to, take on and basically be more uprightly as well, operate more on an upright and a higher vibration, because you understand, your power, and being, you're more connected to your power, right? And you don't actually operate on a dim vibration as the rest of our people, right? So I wanted to read this actually in Daniel. I like this really quick account here, because our people don't really think, they take their own history very lightly, right? Or they don't care about it. This is Daniel 6:1. And I'll read down to verse 3, and it says, "And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom of 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel, an Israelite, was preferred above the presidents and the princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Right. So here it is. Even in captivity, we shun, even in captivity, right? As a matter of fact, let me get that word excellent. Um, it's online. Excellent, so unextinguished for superior merit of any kind, surpassing character or quality, remarkably good, outstanding, prominent, distinguished, superior, surpassing, right? So somebody who's naturally superior. But that's because who we are. We're naturally superior. The scriptures say that wisdom maketh a man's face to shine. And then Daniel was shining within that particular captivity, within that time, that empire, right? So how much more, you understanding the qualities of our forefathers, right? Knowing how they operated within their captivity, right? And then there's multiple different examples. You have Mordecai. For you sisters, there's Esther. If I'm saying, like, Joseph, and what I'm saying, Yahushai. What I'm saying, like, there's so many, like, King David, right? That's why these stories are written. So you actually can operate more on a higher level vibration, right? So I just wanted to, discuss this, something that was just on my mind. But Lord's will, this was quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.